Chapter 24 is the digestive system. I think, unlike the respiratory system, you're a little more conscious and aware of the things going on in your GI tract. We're a little more conscious of the foods we eat. We think about the foods we eat. You may or may not have taken a nutrition course in the past. And I think the digestive system is a little more interesting than the respiratory system. So hopefully you feel the same. Some of the topics: basic functions of our digestive system, major organs and accessory organs, layers of the wall of the GI tract, not the most exciting thing, but we got to understand what tissues are in the GI tract. The peritoneum. The peritoneum is the serous membrane that's found in your abdominal cavity. Then we go down the GI tract and look at what's going on. So we're going to look at the anatomy and the physiology kind of simultaneously as we progress down the GI tract. So we'll look at the oral cavity, tongue, teeth, and saliva. Then we're going to move into the pharynx and then the esophagus. Then we'll talk about the stomach, the small intestines. At the small intestines is where we talk about the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder, because they, in essence, are going to be helping out the small intestines. Then the large intestine, rectum, and anal canal. So we're going to begin by just going through some of the basic functions of your digestive system. First thing we have to do is ingest, so that's taking food into the mouth. There's many places along the GI tract where we secrete other things into the tract. So obviously food has to enter, but we also secrete water, acid, if we're looking at the stomach. We might secrete in a buffer, and then obviously we need enzymes. So those all enter the GI tract into the lumen. So the lumen is basically the space where food needs to be, as well as anything else that gets secreted. There's a lot of mixing and propulsion that occurs. So what accomplishes this is the smooth muscle in the wall. So we'll look at the smooth muscle, how it's controlled, and what these muscular contractions are doing for us, whether it is kind of a mixing or churning that occurs, or just movement down the GI tract, known as peristalsis. There's obviously digestion. The whole system is named after this function. And digestion comes in two forms. There's mechanical digestion, such as mastication or chewing, mixing, and then propulsion, as well as there's chemical digestion. Chemical digestion is where we need enzymes to chemically break down the bonds within the molecules. So the combination of mechanical and chemical digestion results in the final small molecules that we can then absorb into either the bloodstream or the lymphatic system. Remember, it's your dietary fats, such as fatty acids, that go into your lymph. And then defecation, which obviously is elimination of feces from the GI tract. So the goal is to kind of start at ingestion, and when we get to the point where we are defecating, we're done with the chapter. All right, so let's kind of look at the major organs. Now, typically we divide the organs of the digestive system into those that form the actual tract or the tube that starts at the oral cavity and ends at the anus. So those include the oral cavity, your throat or pharynx, the esophagus, stomach, small intestines, large intestines, rectum, and anus. So those are organs that actually form the GI tract, but then we have accessory organs that may add something into the lumen. So for example, salivary glands are going to be producing and secreting saliva into the oral cavity. The liver is going to produce bile. The gallbladder is going to store the bile, and that bile has to be transported into the small intestines. And then the pancreas. The pancreas is going to be adding in a lot of the enzymes that have to function within the small intestine. All right, so that's a look at the digestive system, just looking at the major organs, whether you're a primary kind of forming the tract or you're more of an accessory organ. The next thing I'd like to talk about are the layers. So the GI tract has a wall, right, that surrounds the lumen, and that wall has a lot of different tissue types in it. And we can divide the wall into 4 layers, each layer having certain types of tissue that are involved in the overall process of that part of the tract. So it might change a little bit if you're looking from the stomach maybe to the small intestine and then to the large intestine. Now this portion looks to me like the small intestine. And how I know that is the small intestine has what's known as mesentery. The mesentery attaches to the small intestine and basically holds it in place, as well as houses a lot of the blood vessels, the lymphatic vessels, and the nerves that have to go to and from the small intestine. So this is actually the wall of the small intestine. Again, it might be a little different if we're looking at the stomach or if we're looking at the large intestine, but the 4 layers still have these names, but the tissue within them might change slightly. So we're going to work from the lumen out. So here's the lumen of the small intestine. The layer in direct contact with the lumen is known as the mucosa. The mucosa has an epithelium, so that's going to be this layer of epithelial tissue. It's going to have a little bit of connective tissue in there and a little bit of muscle. It's going to have some lymphatic tissue. So these green dots represent lymphatic nodules, such as MALT, mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. If we progress through the mucosa, we're going to hit the submucosa. And the submucosa is going to be largely connective tissue. It's also going to have some glands in there, and then nerves that will control the glands. The nerves that control the glands are known as the submucosal plexus. So that's these neurons shown here in yellow. So that's the submucosa. Then you go to the muscularis, and the name suggests that the muscularis must be made of muscle. And in this case, at the small intestine, there's 2 layers. There's a circular layer, so the muscle actually is kind of surrounding in a circular pattern. And then there's a longitudinal layer, where the muscles kind of run longitudinally. And these 2 layers will allow that small intestine to kind of squeeze and push the material down the GI tract. When we get to the stomach has an additional 3rd layer called the oblique layer. And this smooth muscle is controlled by a different set of nerves known as the myenteric plexus. So 2 different nerves here controlling either the glands or the muscle. And then finally, the outer layer is called the serosa. That's connective tissue again, and a thin layer of epithelium. All right, so those are the layers of the GI tract. The next thing I want to talk about is the peritoneum. So the peritoneum is the largest serous membrane in the body. So we've already talked about the pericardium and the pleura. So this is the 3rd serous membrane. There's 3 serous membranes. Now remember what they all have in common. They all are going to have a parietal layer that's attached to the wall. So notice right here, this would represent the parietal layer that's physically adhering to the wall of the abdominal cavity. Then the visceral layer, or visceral peritoneum, attaches to the actual viscera, the organs. In this case, small intestines or large intestine or stomach and so forth. And then the cavity in between is called the peritoneal cavity. All right, so very similar to the pericardium and the pleural, that there's a parietal layer and a visceral layer. The big difference is that the peritoneum has a lot of folding to it. So where the peritoneum folds together, it'll help hold things in place. So there's one area that it all folds together and holds on to the small intestines. That's known as the mesentery. So mesentery is part of the peritoneum that kind of packages your small intestines together. And then it attaches it to the back of the abdominal cavity. Mesocolon is very similar, but it's actually attached to the colon. All right, so it kind of holds your large intestine or colon together and attaches it to the back wall. There's also what's known as the greater omentum. So this is a big fold. If you notice, it kind of folds down from your transverse colon and your stomach and covers the anterior portion here of your small intestines. So it's a big giant fold. It's known for accumulating adipose tissue, known as visceral fat. And if you have maybe someone in your family with a quote-unquote beer gut, that is the adipose tissue that accumulates in the greater omentum. So notice there's fat here. This is subcutaneous fat. This is between the skin and your abdominal muscles. But on the inside of the abdominal muscles, you can have this greater omentum that folds down from this transverse colon. There's also a lesser omentum that just kind of holds and attaches the stomach to your liver. All right, so that's part of the peritoneum. So all these greater, lesser omentum, mesentery, and mesocolon are part of the peritoneum used to kind of hold everything in place. If you're an organ that's behind this peritoneal cavity, we call you retroperitoneal. So for example, look at the pancreas. The pancreas is actually not inside this cavity. So it's known as retroperitoneal. This drawing doesn't show your kidneys because they don't lie along the midline, but kidneys are also considered retroperitoneal. Again, that means that they are not found within the peritoneal cavity. So there we go. Retroperitoneal organs, kidneys, pancreas are kind of the classic two. There are parts of the colon and parts of the small intestine that are also considered retroperitoneal. So notice here is the duodenum, which is the first part of your small intestine. It's actually in the retroperitoneal category, whereas a lot of the other parts of the small intestine are inside the peritoneal cavity. Any accumulation, you can get accumulation of fluid in here called ascites. That can be due to a number of different things, but that's just when there's fluid that can, accumulate there. These are just some other pictures. So you'll notice on this picture we see the lesser omentum, again attaching liver and stomach together. Greater omentum kind of folding down from that transverse colon and covering a lot of your small intestines. Here's the mesentery. Notice they've kind of pulled the small intestines out there and it's all attaching the small intestines together. And then here's mesocolon attached to the colon or large intestine. And this mesocolon and mesentery, you'll notice, has a lot of the blood vessels housed within it. All right, that's probably a good introduction. The next video, we're going to kind of start to talk about different forms of digestion, and then we're going to begin our journey starting at the oral cavity and working our way all the way down the GI tract.